Hey everybody, it's Evo here. So I've been asked by a lot of people to make a build guide for the Trickster Totem Explosion build. So I've made a fairly in-depth guide. If I have left anything out, if you guys have any further questions for me, please let me know in the comments. I don't often make build guides. I usually just post videos, so this is a first for me. So yeah, please let me know if there's anything missing. Let me know if there's anything that you'd like to see that I could do differently. But yeah, I'm gonna do a quick X arch here to get things started, and we'll get right into the build. Oh, didn't one-shot him that time. Take care. Leveling with this build is quite simple. What I would recommend is either one, you can get a 200% explode one-hander or a 400 explode bow. You can get these in as early as level 5 to 9, I believe. Those are actually going up substantially in price, so what I would personally recommend now, especially if you're a little bit budget conscious, is to level as Ice Trap until about level 40. That's where about these ones start to drastically go down in price. What I would recommend is getting Honor Home, +2 level of socketed gems with Empower. You could also get a +2 AoE or +2 aura gems Honor Home and level with Rejuvenation Totem, as it has those tags. That way you can have a very early high level totem. Basically with this build, totem life scales your damage. So the higher levels you can get while you're progressing through the campaign, the more damage you can get. I think that's overkill. You can get away with just using a Devouring Totem, Empower, Trap, multiple traps, and an Honor Home. I would also use Frimsorrel. That way you can benefit from Hatred while leveling. It makes leveling a little bit easier as well because you're freezing monsters and you don't have to really worry about defenses as much, as everything on the screen will be frozen. With this setup here, you'll one-shot everything all the way up to Act 10 and early maps, so it makes progression very simple. You don't really have to worry about much at all to make it to the end of the campaign. So here's how I would recommend pathing your passive skill tree when you're progressing through the axe. I would start first going through the physical damage nodes, up through the life, then taking elemental focus and saboteur. I would get up to expeditious munitions quite quickly, so you can take recover 30 life when your trap is triggered by an enemy. That will eventually be swapped out for the 5 additional traps, but this node is very good when you're progressing through the axe. I would then come up to Snowforged and take the elemental inversion node. This is one of the strongest nodes in the game currently. And then I would come up here to take some freeze chance under Winter's Embrace. You have pretty low base freeze chance or 0 base freeze chance up to this point, so especially since we're not critting, so you need to rush some freeze chance right away. From there on, I would either go over here and take this jewel socket and socket in your impossible escape. That way you can start taking these totem life nodes right away. You don't really need to do this if you have a really strong leveling setup or you're not leveling immediately as your totems if you're using Ice Trap to level. But this is a substantial amount of damage while you're leveling up. You could also just throw Ironwood on an Anoint while you're leveling up. You could do either of those. If your damage is totally fine, then you can just start grabbing all of your life nodes right away. Then I would start pathing over to the totem life nodes over here to Primal Manifestation. From there you can pretty much just fill out the rest of the passive skill tree as it's listed in the path of building. The last nodes I would take would be these medium clusters. At level 92, I don't think I had these medium clusters at all. I didn't take them until I started progressing towards level 100. They are strong nodes, I will say that, but they're not immediately needed if you're not level high level 90s. So I'll just do a really quick look at some of the gear on the build. So again, the whole build revolves around this tree node here, and this secondary tree node basically doubles your damage. I went for a bow with +1 socketed gems, a whaling essence for cast speed, and a redeemer modifier for physical damage as extra cold damage. Then multi-modded this with socketed support gems and 30% chance to deal double damage while focused. Since this is a bossing build, I only really care about that small window of time for damage, so if you're using this for more than a bosser, you can definitely switch that over to just flat 10% chance to deal double damage instead of the focus mod. Heat Shiver's mandatory for my version of the build. It more than doubles your damage, 130% more, something like that. Since we're freezing everything and getting max chill stacks, I also have socketed gems, have a 90 cost reservation multiplier. This can be avoided by using a 6-link chest with Enlighten instead of using your movement skill in your chest. I've already reviewed the Asphyxia's Wrath. Try to get one. Honestly, if you want a little bit more defenses, go with the spell suppression. Want some more damage, go with the physical damage as extra cold damage corruption. I'd imagine that having both corruptions is probably quite rare. Torch Oak Seps just for some more totem life. Again, with spell suppression is pretty solid here. Ring is pretty simple, just some dex, life, and resistances. So I went for an amethyst base so I could get some chaos res. My amulet has +1 of all skill gems, life, and dexterity. Again, this build needs a fair bit of dexterity unless you get a bow that needs less dex. I do have Fire Leech on my amulet. You could also get other sources of leech, just make sure that it's generalized life leech, such as Fire Leech, Cold Leech, or Elemental Leech from... I've already listed out some alternatives on another portion of this video. You can get it from a Cluster Jewel, or you can get it from a Corruption on your Asphyxias as well. I went with a Circle of Guilt for scaling my physical damage, so Herald Purity buff effect and physical damage while affected by the Purity. I should probably divine this a little bit. I also needed Dex on here as well, so I get some Dex in the implicit and increased effective cold ailments. It helped out before, I don't really need it anymore now that I have the damage. Again, Slave Driver's Hands. We have a lot of cast speed on the build. We also reserve all of our mana, so these are necessary for this build. Unless you, like I said earlier, if you go EB, you can drop these. You will lose a lot of defenses. Belt's pretty simple, just a Stygian Vice with life, strength, some res, and it had an open prefix, so I did a Redeemer Slam, which had a high chance of hitting either increased hits with against chilled enemies or increased cold damage. Cluster Jewels are physical cluster jewels that give some physical increased damage and a chance to deal double damage. Medium cluster jewels are for heralds which buff your aura effect. I have the Forbidden Flame and Flesh jewels that were mentioned for the Saboteur node. I have 2 of these jewels which just increase my life and my totem's life and give me some dex and resistances. And I have the Impossible Escape for Iron Reflexes, which allows me to spec down here to take Ironwood and the surrounding nodes. I would still take this node, just still a little lower level. I've just been bossing quite a bit with this. I haven't had a chance to get any more levels, so I'll probably be doing some 5-way soon. I don't have the optimal gem links in right now. I also traded out my Determination for Haste just so I could go a little bit faster. Would recommend Determination if you're doing any mapping with the build, but personally I prefer just to go as fast as possible. Links in the bow: Empower, Devouring Totem, Cluster Traps, Anomalous Multiple Traps. This gives us 2 more maximum, which gives us some more burst damage. Trap support, and Enhance. Enhance also increases the totem life, as Devouring Totem has life from its quality there. So yeah, that's a brief overview of the gear that I've chosen to use. Some of it's a little bit flexible, but a lot of it is best in slot. So a little bit about the damage mechanics for the build. The whole build revolves around this node on this bow. Totems explode on death, dealing 600% of their life as physical damage. As this is a secondary to the totem gem itself, no support gems will apply to that explosion's damage, which is why we're going with traps. I'll explain a little bit more about the traps in a little bit here. What we are doing to scale this is, one, we're scaling cold conversion. So we're using a Hatred Watcher's Eye, and we're getting the cold conversion mastery on the tree. And then we're using Hatred as well. This is why Asphyxia's Wrath, which gives, if corrupted, between 30 and 32% of physical damage as extra cold damage. And we're using the Redeemer modifier on the bow to get between 10 and 20% of physical damage as extra cold damage. Since we deal so much base damage, which I'll explain again, and we have a pretty good chance to freeze with the asphyxias and with the nodes on the tree, we'll then use Heat Shiver, which gives us a substantial amount of damage. Basically, it'll double your damage, your cold damage as fire damage. It'll also increase by 30% more as well, because we'll be hitting a 30% chill effect plus freeze on all enemies. So you'll be dealing a little bit more fire damage than you will be dealing cold damage with this build. Another major aspect of scaling the damage with this is totem life, which is why we are taking iron wood, and why we're taking primal manifestation, and also why we're using enhance. Devouring totems quality is increased totem life with 1% per quality. So in the end, what that leaves us with is 18,000, almost 500 totem life, which is then scaled by 600% as our base damage. So that more than compensates us for not being able to use any support gems when you consider the cold conversion, all of the extra cold, all of the extra fire with such a massive base hit. So with this build, in order to apply totems as fast as we can, we are using traps. This is for multiple reasons. One, since support gems don't scale the damage of the explosion, the less damage multipliers also do not apply. Traps are also not subject to totem placement speed, so they're significantly better than self-casting totems, even if you scale totem placement speed as fast as you can. We scale the number of place traps and the number of traps thrown at a time through multiple traps and cluster traps, and from the passive trap mastery, 5 additional traps placed at a time, which greatly increases your burst damage. I've also opted to use the Forbidden Flame Chain Reaction Jewels. This is a huge benefit to being a shadow. How this works essentially is, when you place all your traps at a boss, instead of them proccing when they get triggered and proccing sequentially, and since you don't have a whole lot of trigger area of effect, then oftentimes when you go to kill a boss, you don't really have that much burst. It kind of comes in spurts, where when you take chain reaction, all 32 traps will pop instantaneously, dealing all of your damage at once, which, if you scale the damage high enough, will just instantly delete any Uber in the game. So I would strongly recommend getting a chain reaction jewel if you are Shadow. And I would honestly recommend going Shadow just for that, especially if you're going to be trying to make this a bossing build. Another thing we use in this build are Slave Driver's Hand. This is also multifaceted. One, I don't want to go EB with this build, as it's a hybrid build. We have a lot of ES and life sustain, so I don't really want to go Eldritch Battery or something like that. That being said, you could omit the gloves and go Eldritch Battery. You would just lose a substantial amount of defenses in this build in particular, since we do scale Energy Shield on top of life. Another benefit to the Slave Driver's Hand is that we also scale a fair bit of cast speed on this build. On my bow here, for example, I used an essence of, I believe it's Wailing, to get 48% increased cast speed, which is then translated into trap throwing speed. So all of that put together is we get a lot of traps thrown out very quickly, all exploding at the same time. And that's why traps and, in my opinion, Trickster is going to be the best for putting out as many traps as you can and dealing as much damage as you can. Build also has some fairly niche mechanics as well. The explosion damage is separate from the totem itself. It's secondary damage. The drawback, as previously mentioned, is that support gems won't affect it. It's not spell damage, so that won't apply either. But how that can benefit us is that we can gain Leech and on-kill effects from the explosion. This is another reason why I've decided to go with Trickster. Trickster has a rare ability in the game to get generic damage leached as Energy Shield. Most sources of Energy Shield leech, especially on the tree, are all spell leech, and since this isn't a spell, it does not apply. I have, however, taken the leech mastery, so I can get 10% of my leech being instant. Since we have so many totems proccing at once, when we have life leech and ES leech, when a cluster of totems procs, we get so much instant leech, and we get ES overleach that basically our entire pool gets filled every time a cluster of totems pop. So when you're mapping, it's really nice, especially when you're not built super tanky. But every single pack that you kill, also on top of that with polymath, you really, every single pack completely fills your ES and life. Now some other things we need to do to get Leech. What I chose to do, just because this was very cheap when I made the build, was I went with an amulet with the temple mod that has 0.4% of fire damage leached as life. Now, I can't imagine that there's going to be too many of these amulets that come around, especially that have dex that's needed for the build and +1 level of all skill gems. Alternatively, what you can do is, instead of going for a physical damage large cluster jewel, you can get a cold damage large cluster jewel, and just make sure that it has Doriani's Lesson on it. That will give you 0.2% of your elemental damage leached as life. You need to have a source somewhere on the build for life leech, and that could be elemental leech, fire leech, cold leech. You could also get a corruption on your Asphyxia's Wrath, which would also give you cold leech or fire leech. So there's basically three simple options: the amulet, the large cluster jewel, or the quiver. There may be some other options as well. I'm just not immediately aware of them. But yeah, those are some of the niche interactions when it comes to leech and recovery for the build. Now for defenses on the build, obviously, as you can tell, it's not a very tanky build. I didn't make this build to be tanky. I made it to be as fast and do as much damage as possible. I actually opted to, instead of following this that was posted, I changed this over to use haste instead of determination. I wasn't dying very often in maps, and I found that mobility, especially in softcore in Path of Exile, is just as good defensively as having a high EHP. With haste, you can throw traps faster, you move faster, you lightning warp faster, Everything's faster, so you're able to get out of the way of any big hits. You could lean a little bit more if you decided to into defenses. You can take this route and go Determination. Determination is scaled decently as well when you consider Granite Flask. Purposeful Harbinger will increase your Determination effect by 40%. Your Chest will increase it by another 10 to 15% depending on your implicits. So you can get an okay amount of armor. I also take Spell Suppression from from Instinct. We get the Spell Suppression Mastery. With that paired with Spell Suppression on your chest, I don't know if this is going to be very common to see a suppression and physical damage asphyxias, but you can get Spell Suppression here, and you can also get it on Corruption on Torch Oak Steps. With all of those combined, you can get a Spell Suppression chance of 90%. I think the body armor in this POB, this one does not have Spell Suppression. I've since upgraded since I posted this POB to have a chest that has 20% Spell Suppression, which when you factor in the lucky chance will increase your Spell Suppression chance to 90 to 91%. So yeah, overall, if you're looking for a tanky build, this is not it. I would recommend going with probably the Pathfinder build if you wanted a tankier build, but you will sacrifice a substantial amount of DPS as Poison is hard capped at 30 million DPS, where obviously this is a fair bit higher than that. So yeah, basically if you want a fast build that'll do a lot of damage, that is a little bit squishy, but can burst down bosses, this is what I would choose for sure. One other thing that is a benefit as well is if you are mapping with this build, if this is not your primary, if this is going to be your primary build, you can take Wellspring of Creation. Since we're dealing so much damage, we really don't care about the monster life, and we can just take 25% less damage from all monsters. Taking this node, honestly, I've barely died in maps ever since I've wisened up and spec'd into this. So yeah, again, in summary, not the tankiest build, but it is quite fast, and it does have a fair bit of mobility, so you can get out of the way of anything that might be damaging you, as long as you know the mechanics of the fights that you're doing. So I've also gotten a lot of questions on custom modifiers and how to play with the custom modifiers to actually show what your current damage is. Now, I actually didn't create this exact custom modifier section. This, I believe, was created by the person who made the Chieftain version. I copied it from there and kind of modified it to my own as a way to explain what the damage looks like for the build. So basically you can kind of just follow, honestly, the instructions in here to show what your damage is. Since we're using Ethereal Knives, and Ethereal Knives has a 220% damage effectiveness, what we're going to do is we're going to go to our Calcs tab, we're going to go to our Totem and look at our Totem life, and we're going to take that number and divide it by 2.2. And then we're going to add that as added minimum and maximum spell damage. That way it gets applied to Ethereal Knives. Now, your cast rate on Ethereal Knives must match your trap throwing speed cast rate for your totems. That way you can get a proper look as to what your damage is. Now, oftentimes, since you're taking some cast speed nodes and some trap throwing nodes, this will be quite different from your trap throwing speed. So what you'll do is you'll use more cast speed modifier or less cast speed modifier, depending, to get these two numbers to match. You're going to base your Ethereal Knives cast rate on whatever your cast rate is for your totems. So in this case, I needed to spec in 12% more cast speed to match that 4.48 cast rate. Another part of this as well is the multiple totem damage. Now, in my case, I used a bow that has 70% chance to spawn a second totem. And I also took the mastery for 30%, which means that every time I summon a totem, I summon 2. So for that, I chose 100% more damage, since I'm putting out 2 totems every time. For the explosion multiplier, 600% of your base life means 500% more damage. So 500% more damage. With all traps hitting, this is basically, if you're throwing 5 traps at a time, you're going to do 400% more damage. So every time you throw out the traps, it pops, all of them hit, since you have the chain reaction node. So we multiply our damage then by 4. We also have to account for the actually, you know what? I think POB now considers this already, so we can take that out. My damage might actually be a little bit higher, because I didn't realize that that's probably double dipped now, since POB actually takes into consideration the trees. So if you're using the old POB, you can take that out. Now we also use this to remove the crit chance, as the totems don't have a crit chance. And for me, I just noted that I'm using shock to simulate half of the punishment over the duration of the boss life. This is kind of just PoE or POB numbers, to be completely honest. If we take that off and say that the enemy is on low life, the damage will go up as well. I just did this to kind of get a rough estimate of where my damage is. Since punishment will give a 66% increased damage taken when on low life, I halved that and added it as shock. So yeah, we're not really shocking the enemy. This is just to simulate the punishment. So if you follow those instructions there and just simply match your spell physical damage based on your totem life, and you match your cast rate to your throw speed by basically using a different cast speed modifier, you'll be able to see what your current damage is in game. Now, if you don't have both of the totem modifiers, if you only have one of them, or if you have a 50% on your bow tree, then you can change this number to accommodate for that as well. Now, as some of the prices of some of the gear has dramatically increased in cost, there are a few things that you can do while you're still progressing with the build before you can afford these Forbidden Flame jewels, or the Slave Drivers, or the 2 mod bow, which I believe these are the 2 mod bows that are crafted are going for between like 30 and 40 divines right now. So if you don't have the 2 prop bow, so if you only have the 70% chance to summon 2 totems instead, what you can do is, instead of using enhance, I'm using the wrong POB right now. This is a little bit higher damage. Instead of using the enhance level 4, you would use multiple totems. Another option, or an alternative to the chain reaction jewels if you're looking for damage, is you can take Harness the Void. This is a fair bit of damage right here. You get 18% more damage. You could also honestly use something completely different. You could just use more totem life and percent life and dex jewels. You can fill those jewels with a lot of other things. But if you're looking for damage and you can't afford the other jewels, this is not a bad option. These are fairly cheap. I think the pair is about 2 to 3 divines right now, so it could save you a lot of money. Obviously, you'll lose a fair bit of damage if you don't have chain reaction. You won't lose necessarily damage, but you'll lose the effective burst damage against an Uber boss, but that can be compensated a little bit by taking Harness the Void instead. Again, like I said earlier, with the Slave Drivers, you can take Eldritch Battery, but then you don't really get the ES Leech. If you do it that way, you may even want to consider speccing down into Mind Over Matter. That way you're getting your ES Leech and your ES Recovery. It might be a little bit sketchy since you still need to use ES to cast, but it's not something I've completely looked into, but that may work as well. I'm trying to consider anything else that would be budget. So Impossible Escape obviously is really strong since you get all this totem life. You could also drop an aura since you take charisma as your enchant on your amulet. You could just change that over to Ironwood if you're on a budget. So those three things will drastically reduce the budget of the build. So you're looking at taking off 20 divines there, 30 divines there, and you're looking at taking off 12 divines for the gloves. So without those are the bulk of cost of the build. So you can probably make it with, I don't know, maybe even 10 divines you could make this build if you do the very budget version. Obviously, you'll lose quite a bit in doing that, but it can be done.